The cold wind brushed against the grand marble pillars as the large, solemn hall filled with murmurs. Men and women in expensive suits sat around a long, polished table, their faces stern, their voices low. Cameras flashed silently, recording the gathering of some of the most powerful figures of Europe. At the far end of the hall, a lone figure entered without fanfare. He wore a simple dark jacket, no gold, no silk, no entourage, just a steady gaze and an unshakable calm. At first, no one paid him much attention. He looked too simple, too unimportant. A few advisers whispered among themselves, chuckling at the sight of him. "Another African delegate," one said under his breath with a smirk. The leaders barely glanced at him, continuing their conversations about development aid and stability in Africa as if he were invisible. The tension in the air was almost tangible, yet the young man moved with a quiet dignity, unfazed as he took his seat at the table. An awkward pause settled over the room. A few heads turned, curious now about the man who carried himself without the nervous energy of others. His presence seemed to disturb the natural order they expected. A subtle frown appeared on a diplomat's face, as if questioning why this young nobody was even there. But Ibrahim Traoré remained silent, observing, waiting. His eyes scanned the room, not with fear, but with the eyes of a leader who understood he was standing on the edge of history. His heartbeat was steady, his mind sharper than ever. He knew they had underestimated him already, and that was exactly how he wanted it. A senior European official leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. His eyes narrowed as he looked toward Ibrahim. Then he cleared his throat loudly, addressing him without even using his name. "You from Burkina Faso," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "We hope you understand the seriousness of these matters. Decisions are made here by those with experience." His voice carried the weight of centuries of arrogance, dressed up in polished diplomacy. A soft chuckle echoed from another corner of the room. A woman in a sharp navy suit smirked and whispered something to the man next to her. The message was clear without needing translation. He should listen and not speak. The young leader sat still, his expression unreadable. Not once did his hands tremble, nor did his eyes flicker with anger. He simply waited, letting the weight of their assumptions pile higher and higher. Another official spoke up, this time more bluntly. "If your country cannot manage its own affairs, how can you expect to negotiate with us? Perhaps," he added with a sly smile, "you should consider more guidance from your elders." A ripple of muted laughter rolled across the room. It was a scene repeated countless times through history, an Africa spoken down to, patronized, belittled. But Ibrahim Traoré's silence was not weakness. It was the quiet before the storm. Every slight, every smirk, every arrogant word was being carved deep into the stone of that moment, setting the stage for what was about to come. The room buzzed with self-satisfaction. Papers shuffled, pens clicked, and side conversations bloomed, with the comfort of superiority. Meanwhile, Ibrahim remained unmoved, like a rock in the middle of a river trying to be ignored. His stillness began to feel unsettling to a few around the table. One young age stole glances at him, sensing something was off, but the older diplomats brushed it away with knowing smiles. An official presented a series of demands masked as proposals. They spoke of military bases, security partnerships, and economic cooperation, words that sounded noble but carried the heavy scent of control. Every offer came with strings tied tightly around the future of his people. Ibrahim listened, hands folded, heart burning with the knowledge that history was being written with invisible ink. As the presentations dragged on, a heavy tension began to sink into the room. The air seemed thicker, the light harsher. Some of the more perceptive diplomats began to notice that this young man was not reacting as they had predicted. No nervous nodding, no eager agreements. His eyes, sharp and clear, held a depth that made even the most confident speaker falter for half a second. Whispers began to ripple at the edges of the gathering. Who is he really? Why isn't he intimidated? Why does he look like he's the one judging us? A slow unease crept in, too subtle for most to notice, yet too powerful to ignore. The storm was no longer approaching, it was already inside the room. Suddenly, the grand double doors at the back of the hall swung open with a force that echoed against the marble walls. A group of stern-faced security officers dressed in dark uniforms with insignias of Burkina Faso marched in with measured precision. Behind them followed a small group of dignitaries, African officials and international media, carrying cameras, microphones, and a heavy air of anticipation. The entire room fell into stunned silence. The senior European leaders turned, visibly confused. Whispers flared up like sparks in dry grass. The head of security stepped forward, saluting sharply in Ibrahim's direction. "President Traoré," he announced, his voice steady and loud, "we are ready for your address." For a heartbeat no one moved. The words hung in the air, heavy as iron, as faces paled and jaws tightened. The truth had shattered the comfortable illusions they had built. All eyes snapped back to the man they had ridiculed and dismissed. Ibrahim Traoré rose from his seat slowly, every movement deliberate and commanding. The simple jacket he wore now seemed like a royal mantle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His very presence had changed the temperature of the room. No longer an invisible figure, he was the storm itself. Shock rippled through the assembly. Those who had laughed lowered their eyes. Those who had dismissed him now shifted uncomfortably. In their seats, regret, shame, and fear danced across their once arrogant faces. Ibrahim stood tall, embodying the spirit of a new Africa, proud, unbending, and unafraid. Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, his voice steady, calm, and resonant. There was no anger in his tone, only the weight of undeniable truth. For too long, he began, we have been treated as less, spoken to as if we were children, offered deals that chain us instead of free us. His words cut through the room sharper than any sword, each syllable falling like a heavy drumbeat on the hearts of those present. He spoke not just for Burkina Faso, but for every African nation that had been patronized, exploited, and silenced. His gaze never wavered as he named the injustices, the hypocrisy, the empty promises masked as partnerships. Yet there was no begging in his voice, only a dignified demand for respect, for sovereignty, for the right to stand as equals on the world stage. The leaders who once smirked now sat frozen, their papers forgotten, their strategies crumbling. Cameras captured every moment, broadcasting to millions around the world the image of a young African leader who refused to lower his head. Ibrahim's words were not diplomatic pleasantries. They were the roar of a generation tired of chains, spoken with the wisdom of ancestors and the fire of revolution. As he finished, there was no applause, only a stunned, reverent silence. In that hall, for the first time in a long time, Africa had spoken, and the world had no choice but to listen. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every camera lens, every microphone, every journalist in the hall focused solely on Ibrahim Traoré. The world was watching. Across continents, television screens broadcasted his unwavering stance, his piercing words. In homes, in offices, in crowded streets, people stopped what they were doing to listen. This was no ordinary speech. It was history unfolding in real time. Some of the European leaders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their carefully crafted narratives were collapsing under the weight of truth. A few of them exchanged nervous glances, realizing that the usual tactics of pressure and persuasion would not work here. This man, this young leader, was not playing by their rules. He had come not to negotiate, but to declare a new era. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso and across Africa, the reaction was electric. In marketplaces and villages, in government offices and universities, people watched with pride swelling in their chests. Their leader was not begging for favors. He was not lowering his head. He was standing tall, defying centuries of expectations, proving that Africa was not a passive recipient of orders. It was a force of its own. As Ibrahim stood before the world, his expression never wavered. He had no need for theatrics or raised voices. His mere presence had changed everything. He wasn't just speaking to the men in that room. He was speaking to the future. As the meeting drew to a close, Ibrahim Traoré made no move to humiliate those who had mocked him. There were no sharp rebukes, no public shaming. He understood that true power did not need to boast. It was enough that they knew, enough that the world had seen who had carried dignity and who had carried arrogance. His silence in that final moment spoke louder than any words could. He walked calmly from the table, his head held high, while the officials who once looked down on him sat in quiet shame. Some tried to offer hasty smiles, awkward gestures of reconciliation, but Ibrahim did not entertain their games. His mission was not to make enemies. It was to set a standard where Africa no longer needed to apologize for demanding respect. As he passed through the grand hall, journalists shouted questions. Flashes from cameras lit the way like 1,000 tiny storms. But he did not stop. His path was straight, his vision clear. He was not merely leaving a meeting. He was leaving a mark on history that no amount of politics could erase. And outside those walls, in the hearts of millions who had watched him rise without bowing, something had changed forever. Hope, pride, and a new spirit of resistance had been reborn. Africa had found another voice that could not be silenced. As Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the sunlight outside the grand hall, a gentle breeze stirred the flags overhead. Reporters surged forward, but he remained composed, offering only a few measured words. Africa will no longer bow. We rise with dignity, and we walk forward with our heads held high. His voice was calm, yet it carried across the courtyard with the weight of destiny. Those words traveled farther than anyone in that room could have imagined. Across Africa, across the Caribbean, across every place where the blood of Africa had been spilled, a fire ignited. It was not a fire of violence, but a fire of pride, of self-respect, of determination to reclaim a future that had too often been stolen or delayed. Ibrahim's stand was a message. The age of submission was over. In the days that followed, stories spread of young people painting murals of him, of elders blessing his name in prayer, of leaders in other nations finding new courage to speak boldly. He had not just represented Burkina Faso that day. He had carried the hopes of an entire continent on his shoulders, and he had done so without anger, without hatred, but with a quiet strength that shook the old order to its core. As the sun set behind him, casting long shadows over the land, it was clear a new dawn was rising over Africa, one of dignity, one of sovereignty, one born not from the permission of others, but from the undeniable will of its own people. And Ibrahim Traoré had walked at its front, unbowed and unbroken.